Greetings and welcome back to Switch to Linux. We are going to talk our first Linux experience. I don't know, are we going to be able to do anything without talking about election crap or not? Are we all sick of it now? I think we probably are, aren't we? I don't know.
I think we need a break.
Yeah. I did pull up some good humor. Um, if we need it. I have that pulled up. But I wanted to go today and just kind of take it a little bit slower, a little bit easier. I know this has been an insanely hectic week on my end. I don't know how it is for everybody else, but I almost got caught up, but not quite, but I almost got caught up, and that's why we didn't have a stream yesterday. And I'm hoping to be able to put together and finalize a video for tomorrow as well. But it's getting interesting. Definitely getting interesting. Quint showed up and then he froze. Frozen Quint. Frozen Quint. I'll have to click on Dan until Quint comes back. Oh, there's Quint. He's on Frozen now. All right.
It has been pretty busy.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, we got you, Quint.
Oh, we got you,
Okay.
buddy.
All right. Cool.
I'm in the Jitsi client this time, so hopefully that's a bit better.
Ooh, nice. Yeah, we'll see how it runs. So I will go ahead and so what we're going to do here, we want to talk about first Linux experiences, and we're going to break up the questions so that we can make sure that everyone gets about equal time. So I don't want to be like, hey, your turn, and just start rattling on for like 10 minutes about this, that, and the other. We want to keep on target with each question we're going to do. So we'll kind of start with what first caused you to look at Linux, and then we're going to do what were the great things. Then we'll do another series of questions on what was not so great. What would you miss if you were to drop Linux? Or excuse me, what would you miss? What would you miss if you dropped everything but Linux? And what would you miss if you dropped Linux? So I'm going to write those down and hopefully
everything but Linux. I don't understand that one. I really don't.
So like if you had to use Linux only, and I know some of you might actually, but if you had to use Linux only, what would you miss? That's kind of what's so hard. So we're going to start in and say, we'll kind of two-part on this one. What was the first Linux distribution you used, and what made you test it out? And top of the field, we'll go to Quint on the top.
Okay, so this is actually, I'm going to go back before. So there was a time when I used Linux before I knew I was using it. And this was, I think it was for Christmas. When I was 10 years old for Christmas, my grandmother bought me this thing called a Kano computer kit. It was this thing where it was like a Raspberry Pi, and it was like you would build it out, and it had its own like custom version of Raspbian on it that had like games and like coding and stuff on it. That was really the first time I used like something that was Linux based, and that's how I got into this whole thing. Is once I learned more about like what actually powered it, like the Raspberry Pi, that's how I started to get into desktop Linux. It wasn't like a thing where like I hated like Windows and I switched to Linux. It wasn't like that for me. The first Linux was it the first Linux distribution I used? Is that what it was?
Yeah, what was the first one you used?
Yeah.
For
it
you,
was probably a Ubuntu 16, or it was either the first Linux distribution I used technically was the Raspbian. It was Raspbian, the one that was on the Kano computer. But technically, like the first Linux distribution I used that I installed on a virtual machine, like I knew I was using Linux, was Ubuntu 16.04.
Okay, very good. All right. Mark, we'll go down with you and tell us about your first experience on Linux. Like, why did you first test it out, and what was your first experience like?
Before I start, Quint, what was your overall experience? Was it good?
We'll do that as a separate question.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I think it's interesting to know how. Okay, first experience with Linux, first ever time that I can remember, as far back as I can go, is around 2004, 2005 circa, and it was with Linspire. At that time, I was looking at taking the networking curriculum classes at the college, and I knew that Linux would be a part of my curriculum, which is what I'm thinking led me to start searching and looking up Linux. It was probably closer to 2005, 2006 when I first began the networking admin curriculum. Linspire, I specifically picked it out because actually, I don't know if they were made by FreeSpire, which was a fork off of Mandrake, or maybe it was Mandriva years ago, but the operating system was called Linspire. It was based on a previous project that was forked over that was called FreeSpire. The reason I chose Linspire is something called Click to Run, and it would supposedly enable me to install applications much easier just by clicking the mouse and running, something that we have in Linux everywhere now. It's just a given now. But at that time, Linux was very early in its development still. And even though it had had some years, it was very slow to develop. And at that time, being able to click on and run an application that I needed for school was something that was very enticing to me. I didn't quite figure it out. It was a little more complicated.
We'll get into that when we talk about the overall experiences.
Yeah. So that was it. Linspire. Yep.
All right. Dan.
Sorry, I'm long-winded. I'll try to do better.
Yeah.
Which first time would you like? The very first time?
Let's go with. I know you got a stack there. So what was your very, very top? What's the
and the one I stuck with?
What's the first one on your stack?
The very first one on my stack is Fedora 4.
Wowzers.
I also have 5, 6, and 7 as well.
So was the crust on the earth hard back then?
No, it was very rocky,
Very rocky,
you used the IRC channel to get any assistance, and the internet was a mess. However, it was much easier to use and make things for. But
yeah, very good.
I'll try and say this as close as I can to my memory.
Okay, and why did you first try it out?
I wanted to see what it was about. I didn't know what was a popular distro, so I kind of liked the Fedora hat and the whole deal. I ran across, as I was playing with this and trying to get some help, and you had to use mostly command line stuff to get where you wanted to go, which I was horrible at. And I came across this thing, and I had an extra computer, and I came across this stuff called Apache-ware that was used to actually make an FTP, like server. And it was all like a script file, if I remember correctly, that you had to put together to make it work. But I went in that direction, and I kind of thought, well, I can do HTML for a web page good enough to actually make that work. And I assembled the Apache-ware and went through the wiki and figured out how to put in passwords and all that stuff, and how to make it display an HTML file out on the internet. And it took me several weeks to do it. It took me a while.
Okay.
And next thing you know, I had it all set up. I put it in my spare machine. I put the spare machine down in my basement and connected it to the Ethernet. And then, there's this stuff you could get. I forgot what it was. No IP is what it was called. You actually could apply to this service on the internet, and they would give you a domain with a rotating IP address number. Mm-hmm. So your domain name would, actually go on whatever number they gave you, and it'd make it work on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So
let's circle back around on that with some of our first overall experience and stuff. I want to go ahead and hit the comments real quick because I always forget the comments. My apologies, guys. But I'm just going to scan through and look for the first experiences. I guess Hurrian tried it because Windows 10 ran like crap, I guess. Let's see. We have OpenSUSE showing up in there. Nigel went from Ubuntu to Mint to Manjaro to Arch and ArchFi. Let's see. I don't think Arch is too difficult to learn, honestly. There's a Slackware in 95. Nice. Another old one. Been on Ubuntu for some years, mostly active past 3 years, especially for networking. All right. If drivers work in one distro and not in the other, what's the point of using a defective distros? There you go. Testing CentOS is a good one there. All right, let's see. Hello, Moonbase Alpha Grays. Take me to your Moonbase. Get me off this rock, especially this week.
You're no kidding.
I'd like to come back in a few days, maybe a few weeks. Maybe we'll come back in a few years, right? A few years, 4 years. That sound good? No, we're not going to count Android for this case here because it's really, I mean, it's based on Linux, but it's not really Linux here. First Linux Red Hat server for John Walsh. All right. Ubuntu 16.04 and a dedicated server without a GUI. Blue Play, whatever. Let's see, Mint XFCE stuff. All right, so going through. Of course, the first time I played around was Ubuntu 11.04, and when I was working at a software startup company, I was doing the phone calls with people. I had 2 laptops set up, and one was my Salesforce instance with all of our client data, and then the other one I was using to actually do screen share conferences online and stuff. This is going back, of course, like 10 years, like video conferencing online. Actually, I think we were doing more. It was weird. It was a weird time back then, if you can imagine. But I had this crappy compact computer that they had this really poor design. It was like a $200 computer. And they skimped wherever they could, and they literally screwed the hard drive directly into the main chassis of the computer. And so if you just slide the computer across the desk, it would push all the shock right into the hard drive. That thing burnt through like 2 or 3 hard drives in the first 6 months. And so I'm like, can I run Windows on an external hard drive doing Google searches for that on Google? And I was like, no, but I found this thing called Ubuntu that says it can. Sure, why not? Spin that guy up in an external hard drive, because the external hard drive I could keep more protected without having to throw a new hard drive in the main system. And it worked. I mean, it worked overall. So it allowed me to check my email, allowed me to put my calendars on there, allowed me to run my Salesforce instance while my main microshaft Windows PC was monitoring all of the conferencing stuff. My overall first experience was okay. It was nothing that's like, wow, I got to drop Windows and go over to Ubuntu, but it was good. It was positive. But then once I got that computer replaced with a better computer that didn't crash the hard drive, I just went ahead and went back to Windows for a while until, Microsoft just decided to release Spyware 10. So with that, Dan, we're already on you, so we'll go from you on up the list this time. Tell us about your first overall experience.
Okay, like I said, with the Fedora, I made a neat little server, and I put all the family pictures and everything on it, and all the MP3s I'd collected and all that other stuff. And it worked good for a long time, and the family and stuff kind of slowly started to lose interest in it, and it did consume a little bit of power, which ate into my electric bill. So after a while, that computer just died, and I did nothing more with it. Meanwhile, my main machine was still a Windows machine, and it was an XP machine.
Yeah, XP.
So I stayed with that, and then I upgraded to 7 and stuff like that. And then I actually wanted to take a look at Linux again down the road. I don't know. This one says, I heard about this thing called Ubuntu. So here I have an Ubuntu version 9.04.
Is that like African Hugs or something? I don't know.
Yeah, I heard, what's this Ubuntu stuff? Some fruity drink, like Toss's friend would say. So actually, I loaded up. I had a number of empty hard drives around here, so it's real easy for me to install Ubuntu on a hard drive and take a look at it. And I looked at it, and I really didn't like the desktop that came with it. I think it was Unity. One of the Ubuntus I tried was either you could get GNOME or KDE with it out of the box, and there was not much else to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
But it wouldn't replace any of the Windows software that I was using, nor did I know how to go and get an equivalent. And, I wasn't quite engaged in so many social media platforms to get any help or anything. So I stopped looking at the Ubuntu. And then again, and this one I think is dated. Oh, this one's 1404. Yeah, the first one I was just talking about, I tried it, and that's a 10 of 09. Wow. So I looked at the Ubuntu again, 14.04, and I played with it and seeing if anything had changed on it and stuff like that, and went fishing around in it, did some online reading and stuff like that. And then I lost interest in it. And that went to the wayside. Okay. And then a few years after that, I think it was 2015 or 16, they come out with this Windows spyware.
Yeah.
And I was still safe on 7. So I had some time still to go with that. I installed the spyware 10 on my laptop, my extra laptop that I got here. And it got to the point where it actually displayed the EULA, and you had to agree to it to move forward because it was a very early version. It was when they were giving it out strictly for free.
Ooh.
You know, I started, something told me to read this thing. I started reading into it, and it's like everything in it. Microsoft will keylog you, look at your files, delete files it thinks it's illegal, and all this other stuff.
Delete your movie collection that is legally yours. You know, no, you're not allowed to have that. Nobody wants you to have that. You're supposed to license that for the rest of your life, not own it.
Yeah, delete all your MP3s, even though you bought them from every store on the internet.
Yep.
So, at that point, I thought there's got to be a better solution. So I started looking around, and Linux came to mind again. This is where I started looking into your YouTube channel and other people's YouTube channel.
New and bad back then.
And then on one of the channels, they were talking about DistroWatch. So I went over to DistroWatch, and I'm looking at this thing that's at the top called Mint. I'm like, I'll give Mint a try. One of the other channels said it's great for newbies.
Yeah.
So I installed the Mint, and I stayed on it and played with it. I really did like it, and I figured out what I could. And at the same time I'm doing this, I'm now getting into social media where I can make some Linuxy friends, and they would give me advice and stuff like that.
Let's wrap up here in a minute or so we can jump on to next. But go ahead, keep going.
So that's what I did is I got some friends in social media places that could help me with mainly the software equivalents. I figured out I could use Windows in a virtual machine, which none of the other distros I had tested before that, gave me a clue what a virtual machine even was. I didn't even know what a virtual machine was until I actually started playing with Linux. Mm-hmm. And at that point, I was able to put Windows in a virtual machine. That took care of getting in and out of my iPhone. And then the rest of the stuff I kind of found equivalents to, by people telling me, try this for a music player, try this. Our Office suite in Linux is LibreOffice. Give that a shot.
Yeah. I remember trying to install Microsoft Office and Adobe products and going, can I get these to work? And then it's like, I don't need to.
To migrate into Linux as a full-time operating system and using it every day, I would recommend people become friends with some of the other people in the social media spots. Watch quite a few my first year, man, I must have hit up every YouTube video that came out. Mm-hmm. Starting with yours and Toss's and stuff like that, and then I got pretty used to it, and then I got into learning how to actually do things in the terminal, minor things like update your system.
Let's go ahead and get into some of that when we talk about what's great and what's not so great. So we'll move on to Mark.
Sure. I can go on for another half
I know.
hour.
I want to move through and have a good, concise show and stuff today. So it's just been that kind of week. So Mark, you're up. What was your first overall experience? Are you there, Mark?
Hello, Mark.
All right, we'll go up to Quint. Mark, if you're there.
I was muted. Go ahead.
Never mind.
Quint.
All right.
Okay.
No, go ahead, Mark.
Okay.
No, Mark. Go ahead.
My first Linux experience, like I said, I thought I answered that from the front, but was Linspire, and it was a click and run functionality that I desired. Linspire was formerly known as FreeSpire. It was very confusing for me. Like I said, I I was very new to Linux, and I didn't understand the terminal, which was explains the draw that the click
Yeah.
to run had for me.
I have a
and
confession to make in the middle of this.
it was
As I was a
confusing.
web designer for a long time, like I'd oftentimes look something up, some obscure thing, and I'd see something that's like, do this in your terminal. I'm like, what the hell is that? I don't even know what that is.
Yeah.
To get learning Linux to figure out,
Yeah.
oh, no, it's easy. All right, good.
And I knew Windows command line because I had been on Windows my whole life. But as with anything, it's a good segue to finish it up and just say, even though I had a frustrating, confusing experience and I wasn't able to keep Linspire and use it on my system, it was a learning process, and I'm glad that I tried and worked so hard at it. I did not blame it on Linux. The experience was on me because I kind of jumped in and dove in deep where I probably should have started out with something like Ubuntu or Linux Mint had. I'm not sure if Linux Mint was around at the time. I think it was pretty early on in development, but I didn't blame my bad experience on Linux. I pretty much chalked it up to me being very new, and I tried other distros, and I had a little bit better luck.
Yep.
So
right.
that's pretty much the grunt of it.
All right. Quint, first overall experience.
So yeah, like I was saying, I pulled out the thing. This was the Kano computer kit I got. It's the same one. It was essentially a Raspberry Pi. I think they still make these. I'm not sure. They actually do. Unfortunately, this same company now makes a Windows laptop that's now being targeted towards kids. But their original product was Raspberry Pi. And so it was like you had all this stuff in here. It was like you got a Raspberry Pi right here. There was like this little book right here, or there was like a speaker part. There was this little book here that would like tell you how to put everything together. It was this cool thing.
Yeah.
And it was just a Christmas gift that I got. And so once I started looking at this, I used it. I played around with it for a long time. And then eventually I lost interest in it, probably about a year later. And then, I lost interest in it and did other things. But then eventually one day, I guess this was probably late 2016, I decided to pull this thing out again just to see what was in here because I hadn't used it in a while. I pulled it out, and now I was older at that time. I was probably 12. And I started researching some of the components that were in here. Like I started researching like what a Raspberry Pi was and stuff like that. And then that's when I came across like Linux and different stuff like that. But then eventually, I used the Raspberry Pi, on Raspbian for a while. And then eventually I just decided that I wanted to try full-on desktop Linux. At this time, the only computer I had was a MacBook Air. So I threw it up in a virtual machine, and somehow I got it running that MacBook Air that only had 4 gigs of RAM. I don't know how I did that, but I was able to try Ubuntu 16.04. I think I just looked up, I think I just figured out that Ubuntu was a new user distro.
Yeah.
That was one that came up a lot. So I tried that, and then I tried, and I really liked it. I didn't see myself using it full time at that point, because I still had to use the Mac, and I still do have to use the Mac now.
Yeah,
but
stuff.
I kept trying other Ubuntu-based distros. And then one of the first things I did try, though, is I really hated Unity. That was back when Ubuntu still used Unity. I just really didn't like it. And so I figured out that Ubuntu had different spins. I guess it's actually spins is Fedora. I don't remember what it's called on Ubuntu.
It's like community builds, I think.
Yeah. And I figured out there was one that used something called the GNOME desktop. And after looking at the pictures, I was like, wow, this really looks nice.
And you're the only one.
I tried Ubuntu GNOME, and I just fell in love with GNOME. It felt a lot like a Mac, which is why I like it so much. Like it has very similar UI elements.
Very good.
Cool. I hadn't used Windows in a while at that point. I was mainly a Mac user then. So that's what I chose to go with. I tried a whole bunch of other distros. I tried lots of other Ubuntu-based distros that use GNOME. Like I used Zorin OS. I tried a whole bunch of other ones.
And you're
And
finally on Fedora. What caused you to stick with Fedora?
so I'll get to that in a minute. I'm almost done talking about Ubuntu, but I tried different stuff, and I eventually just weaved my way up to get more advanced. Like once I tried all the Ubuntu distros, I switched to Debian. I tried Debian. This was all, just remember that back at this time, this was all on virtual machines on my Mac. And so I tried Debian. Then I started trying more and more distros. I tried Manjaro, and then I think eventually I ended up trying Fedora because I wanted to try something that wasn't Debian-based. I was sick of all the Debian-based distros. I tried Fedora. The first version I used was Fedora 26. I really just fell in love with it. I love the stock GNOME environment that it had. I really love the DNF package manager. I still think it's a way better package manager compared to apt, in my opinion. And that's just the distro that I really fell in love with. And so when then finally, when I was in 8th grade, I decided that I wanted to put Linux on a computer. So I bought my Lenovo ThinkStation here off eBay. I put new parts in it, and I put Fedora on it. And that's what I've still been using to this day as my desktop. I still have a Mac. I don't have the same MacBook here. I have a Pro now. But that's what I use mainly day to day is the Mac.
Yeah, and for you guys watching, that's like school requirements, right?
It's school requirements, but I use this computer almost every day now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I guess one more thing I'll throw into my overall first experience. Unity grew on me. I could see myself using it. The one thing I was really missing is I really, really used the task manager on the bottom to show me all the windows. And I was trying to hack those into Ubuntu, which you can do. But then when I found Linux Mint, it's like, this is exactly what I've been looking for. And that's really why I stick with that.
That was my experience.
The main thing why I didn't like, I'm just going to say a little thing, but why I didn't go like the Linux Mint route is because I was a Mac user.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense to go Fedora. Thank you for that super chat, Dan. Appreciate that. Ben, welcome. Greetings. How's it going?
It's going good. How are you, Tom?
Very good. You want to give us a quick few minute summary? We'll get you we're only 3 questions in. So,
Okay.
Why did you start Linux? What was your first distro and what was your first overall experience?
Well, I was probably, I don't even remember how old I was back in that day, but it was around, I've been using it for over 11 years, so it's a good while ago. But my first distro was Just Use Linux 8. It was based on Ubuntu 8.04 back then. Okay. And it was 0147. And I didn't know what the heck I was doing with it. I couldn't even get the dang thing installed because it used, back then Ubuntu used Unsplash, which was the splash screen that they used to boot up before Plymouth came around. And the boot splash screen was broken, and I didn't realize that until the developer Justin Braddock made a video about it. And so, long story short, I went to mainline Ubuntu back around the 10.x days, and I tried Arch, which was a newbie mistake. Mm-hmm. And then when they changed to 11.04, I went to Gentoo, and so I didn't know what the heck I was doing with that either, and I needed a lot of help from my buddy Zach on Skype. Kudos to you, by the way, Zach, for showing me actually how to properly install Gentoo with GNOME 2 at the time. And that was actually a lot of fun. And, I'll always remember those days as my favorite days of Linux back in the GNOME 2 days. Mm-hmm. And that's also part of why I love Mate, is because it's a continuation of GNOME 2. But, I just, it was the fun. Linux to me is supposed to be a fun operating system. It's fun, mm-hmm. And that's what keeps me going with Linux is, the fun, the learning, and the et cetera. And, I've just always stuck to Gentoo because I like to learn. You see, mm-hmm. in my opinion, this is not to everybody, but, if you're not learning something, then Linux it's a tool. It's not something that you're, you're gonna, I mean, I love Linux, don't get me wrong, but if you're gaming or if you're doing like high end stuff, Linux is not something you're going to stick to. I mean, yes, you can try it, but if it doesn't work for your workflow, what's the point?
Yeah.
But I mean, there are certain tasks that I'm sorry, they're just not going to get done. I mean, anyway, that's a debate for another day. But
Cool.
My Linux experience was a positive one, and it's always going to be that way.
Good.
Yeah.
Our next question is going to be briefly summarize what's great and what's bad about it, which you kind of did there. You talked about a lot of great things, excellent learning experience, and bad things.
Yes.
Gaming still isn't there, although getting better.
No, it's getting slightly better, yes. But I mean, my experience in the beginning was I was getting a lot of RTFM, not so much help, despite what I told them.
Yeah.
And I sort of had to really get it dumbed down and things. But as I grew older, I started to realize that, there are times where you have to RTFM sometimes. But I mean, overall, it's been pretty good. I would say I don't have any complaints.
Cool. All right. Quint, we'll jump back down to you. Summarize. What's the great parts? What's the bad parts?
The great.
So one of the thing, unlike a lot of you guys, I probably should have mentioned this before. I didn't really look much into the community. I watched like YouTube videos and I read like documentation, but I never really asked people for help because a lot of the stuff that I needed to figure out had already been done. So I never really asked anybody for help, like online or anything. And I was in middle school at this point, so I was kind of like nervous about doing that. But I've pretty much had a positive experience with it. Like when I first started out, it was really just like a fun thing to play with. Like I didn't see myself using it. But once I started, to learn more about it and learn more of the command line, and this was all just gradually just working my way up to more advanced stuff. I started to realize how this was just this could be a full-on computer replacement. And so I've never really had any bad experiences with Linux, I don't think. I think everything that I've had is good. I don't have any like weird hardware or anything, so I've never had like any like driver issues, but I think my overall Linux experience has been very positive.
Good. Very good. Mark, good and bad in your perspective.
The good is that Linux has come such a long way in development. The early days were awfully rough, and for me, with a lot of different distros. The good is that there's a lot of new user-friendly distros. The good is the community in Linux that I want to highlight for a moment, that even though there is some toxic people, as is with any community, there is going to be people that you really would rather they're not part of the community because they tend to drag people down. The Linux community is one of the most friendly, passionate, yet can be very helpful communities on the internet. It's where I've made a lot of friends, as you see, 3 guys here that I care a lot about. And I guess the bad in Linux is that it's a different animal. It's a completely different operating system. There can be a little bit of a steeper learning curve on certain distros. But then again, you use new user-friendly stuff like Ubuntu and Linux Mint and maybe Zorin OS, Pop OS even. If you like GNOME, check out Pop OS. But yeah, the only bad experience is just the process in learning it can be a little bit of a steep learning curve. But in modern day Linux, it's gotten so much better and so much more easy to pick up and play with certain distros.
Yeah.
And just beating your head against the table sometimes to learn things can be frustrating, but it's worth it when you do learn it. So I don't even know if I would say overall Linux has been a very positive experience in the big picture. With all the struggles, have come a lot of success and a lot of good things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good and bad. Dan, good and bad on your end.
I'd say the good thing about Linux is there's probably a distro out there to suit most people's needs, and you have to kind of try them all to find out which one you like the best. Um, the community is absolutely great. Um, the bad I would say about Linux is trying to get started with it in the beginning. In the beginning, there's like a tremendous amount of reading you want to do to accomplish certain things. But once you get that out of the way, you're in the good again. And like when I first started, I have games on my machine. I learned how to actually take a second 1 GB hard drive and move all my games over to that hard drive. I learned how to set up Steam. I learned how to set up the FastTab files so it will automatically mount that drive when the computer starts up and the games are all there. There's all kinds of little tricks and things. Another great thing about Linux is completely different from Windows, meaning that it's modular. Every little piece in it seems to have a modular, like Pulse Audio, Plymouth, Light DM, System D. I mean, I actually encouraged another YouTuber to make a video about this, to list all these things and what they do and all that. And he made like 5 videos in easy to layman terms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But because I was confused and I was looking for some help and understanding some of the stuff, and I'm still confused. But still, if someone says, what is Plymouth? I know what it is. And there is a lot of learning. It's like, it's a different animal, but in a great way.
Yeah, for sure. From my perspective, I think great and bad. As Anna Rita says, there's a lot of choice. I am not in the camp that says we should consolidate down and just have a single one, because if you consolidate everything down, just have one single Linux distro, it's going to become the next Windows or Mac. We want the variety, and there's really only a handful of major distros, I would say, out there, and so I don't mind that as much. Go ahead.
Linux is like a box of Legos.
Yeah. You open the thing up and you just see what happens.
You can snap it all together.
I heard a really good explanation of Linux. It was like comparing the different operating systems as airlines. And they said that with Linux, you had to build the seat yourself, but everything was awesome once that was done.
Yeah, there was it might have been I think it was Pizza Loving Nerd sent out this joke at one point in time, or maybe it was somebody else, I forget, but there's a Linux guy, a Windows guy, and a Mac guy, and the light bulb burns out, and they're like, "What do you need to do?" And they're like, "Well, let's go get these fixed and come back." And so, after quite a while, the Windows guy and the Mac guy are sitting there going, I don't know, where's the Linux guy? They go find him, and they go over there to find him, and they're like, "Well, did you get yours done?" To the Windows guy, and he's like, "Well, I don't know. I just decided I'm just going to go without it. Just figure it out." And the Mac guy says, "Well, I just couldn't replace the light bulb, so I just bought a new house." Linux guy's sitting there with a box of parts, reading a bunch of instructions, going, "This light bulb ain't going to build itself." So, and that's kind of how Linux can be. It is excellent, to Ben's point. Ben jumped off here, but his excellent point, it is an excellent place to learn. Like, even I was considered a computer expert dude well before I learned about Linux. And when I got into Linux, I realized just how much I have no earthly idea. And that's the power of what it can do.
I was the same way. I have been tech support for my class for as long as I can remember. And that was way before Linux. It was Mac.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if I look at what I did then and the things I run now, like right now, like this is what blows my mind now about when I got into the Linux world, is right now we are doing this teleconference call, and I got people all over the country, and I know a couple of my Friends International weren't able to jump on, but we're all doing this on a Linux server that I built with a terminal from some other server SSHing into it. It's like, and we're on a video conference call that I control with my servers. And that's really awesome. And I have a full central NAS system. I have a VPN that I can access my home office from anywhere around the world if I need to get into there with my network shares. I have a Nextcloud server that can do all of those things that the big tech companies want to do with my stuff, and I just won't let them because I control all the stuff. And I've learned all that because I jumped over onto Linux. And it's an excellent thing just to get out there and to learn and to figure out what you need to do.
It's just same thing with me too. The fact that I have a whole server in there running Linux that's just dedicated to running other Linux systems, that's just really cool to me.
Mm-hmm. All right. Let's take the last 15 minutes. If there's anything else we really want to say about Linux, let's say it now. Let's just take the next 15 minutes and just kind of goof off for a little bit. I pulled up some fun comedy articles. I've been following the Babylon Bee lately, which is like Christian satire, because they've just been doing the best job of satire than anybody in the world right now. And I pulled that up because it's been a crazy, stressful week for all of us Americans. No matter which direction you wanted to go, which direction you want the elections to go, we just don't know. And it's going to turn into the giant, messy court battle. And then we'll probably have rioting and protesting in the streets. So we got to laugh a little bit. So I hope you guys enjoyed the Linuxy part. We're just going to hang out for another 15 minutes before we cut down the stream. But I will also be streaming on my Christian channel tonight. I'll go ahead and drop the link in there. I'll let you guys say anything else you want to say about Linux, and then we'll talk about other stuff for 15 minutes. So anybody jump on in.
I'm trying to think what else I have to say about Linux. Mainly, a lot of the stuff that I've just figured out how to accomplish with Linux over the past 4 years, such as now, when I first started with Linux, it was on a Raspberry Pi. It was on the original Raspberry Pi, which I have in here in the kit. I bought other Raspberry Pis just to try them out, and then eventually, when I got bored of those, I just decided to start using desktop Linux. And now I have completely have so much Linux stuff. Now I have or really I should just say open source in general, like my router, which runs pfSense, which is FreeBSD. So I can't really classify that as Linux.
It's close. But...
Then I have all sorts of other networking equipment. I have my server, which is running XCPNG, which is essentially a special version of CentOS that's Zen enabled, which allows you to run other virtual systems on top of it. I have this computer. I have so much other Linux stuff. And really, it's not just Linux. Like, getting into Linux really got me into technology a lot more than I would have had before. I really got into networking because of Linux. And now I have all this cool stuff. Like, I have all this cool Ubiquiti stuff now. And we can actually get Wi-Fi throughout our whole house now. Before when we had Comcast, we literally had this was a really bizarre setup. When we had Comcast, we had 2 cable modems. And the whole thing was all janky and screwy, and it just didn't work very well. And it was all just to try to get Wi-Fi throughout the whole house.
Yeah, and you can do that now with the normie hardware and software, but you'll have some issues.
This was really back before a lot of that normie stuff existed.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and that's the thing. And I have a video, if you guys haven't seen it. For some reason, YouTube down promoted this one too, but I actually have a video about how to make a wireless access point out of a Raspberry Pi. It's kind of fun, actually, which actually works just about as well as my Cisco router does.
I really don't have... I would consider it, but considering right now on Wi-Fi, I can get 400 megabits on Wi-Fi through my Ubiquiti access point.
Oh yeah, you're gonna get better signal through that for sure. Let me look at Discord though before we wrap everything up here. Kay's first experience was Fedora 2829. Most of his parents at the time were helicopter parents, so I had to install a new OS to have control over your computers. I don't even know how to turn this on. What's up, Mark?
Explain why Linux is floss. We didn't mention open source. That's huge.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark. Just talk a little bit about open source there.
I'll be brief. Open source software differs in proprietary software because it is audited by the community. It's open for anyone to audit or read through. It's also open to create your own projects based off of using the GPL license. Often there are other license types I'm not as familiar with, but the GNU open source license, that's the beauty of Floss. The advantages there are it's more secure because if the community's got its eyes on it at all times, so any Linux distribution is going to be more secure from the ground up. Not only because it's open source, it's literally built in such a way that it's much more secure. It's very modular, like Dan said. I'll leave off and I'll say Linux, an ode to Linux. Linux is superior to Windows or Mac or Mac. Linux is more secure than Windows or Mac. Linux is everywhere. Linux is floss. Linux is love.
Absolutely.
That was
I want to address this question from Freebeing. Is it safe to partition a hard drive to have Windows 10 on one and Linux on the other? If you are a more experienced computer user, you can do that. Many Linux distributions will automatically partition your drive for you, like Ubuntu, Mint. These will automatically partition a hard drive for you. The downside is having one hard drive with multiple operating systems is they have competing bootloaders. And if Windows issues an update to the bootloader, it will overwrite the Linux bootloader. Now, the Linux bootloader is perfectly capable of booting Windows or booting Linux, but the Windows bootloader does not like Linux. And so if there's a Windows update that updates the bootloader, it will wipe out the bootloader for Linux. And so you have to be careful of that. There's ways to get it back. You just need to reinstall grub on the hard drive. So it's a little bit more advanced. Generally, it's going to be safe. It's safer for the Linux partition than the Windows partition because the Windows partition sees something as there, but it can't read the Linux partition by default. Whereas Linux should be able to read both partitions just fine.
I do recommend a separate drive altogether just for Linux.
Correct. That's the best. If you have the capability of multiple hard drives, go ahead. Dan.
If you have a computer that has a boot key to select what you want to boot from, that's usually the best way to go with a second hard drive.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually possible to use separate bootloaders on this single drive. If you set one up as EFI and the other up as a BIOS. Yep. I've actually done that before, where I would actually select which way I would boot into the partition itself, and that way it kept even the bootloaders isolated on a single drive. More complicated, but it actually worked well for me.
Yeah, I imagine.
Speaking of what Mark said about open source, that's one of the other reasons I didn't really talk about is I really like the whole idea of open source. I thought it was a great idea. And I've explained open source to a lot of people, and the first thing that a lot of people think is if it's open, doesn't that mean that some hacker can come in and just change all the code? And I have to explain to them that there's like this whole governing body behind it. It's not just a free-for-all. That's what a lot of people think, that it's just a free-for-all. But it's
because the distro package maintainers, they look at that stuff before they put that stuff in their repos for you to download.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and have a look at. You guys won't be able to see it until the stream catches up.
It has to be regularly audited, and there are certain repositories online for software. They go through rigorous testing, and they look through it thorough, and the right people, the experienced developers. And a lot of these main distro makers like Manjaro, for instance, have a pretty thorough way to authenticate and validate packages before it ever hits a client's machine or ever gets added to the repo. So it's not, there's more than just checking it and having eyes on it. It's much more thorough in most situations.
Yeah. do a video on that trick, dual booting with separate bootloaders. Yeah, it was something I was doing. I did that because I had my writing computer, which was a Lenovo S21E with a 32 gigabyte soldered SSD in it. And it actually, for the long time, I actually dual booted that thing between Windows was on half of it and Peppermint was on the other half. And I used the default Windows, of course, used EFI. And then what I did is I changed the BIOS over to prioritize. I might be getting the terminology wrong here, but to use the basic BIOS, I prioritized that and installed Peppermint on that. And whatever you use to install or to load up the live key that you're using as installation medium, it's going to install utilizing that method. So I booted up Peppermint with BIOS, and so when I installed it, it installed Peppermint and the bootloader on the BIOS, and Windows kept the EFI. And then what I did is I prioritized the BIOS to always boot into BIOS rather than EFI, so that it would always go into Peppermint unless I overrode it by hitting the F12 key on boot. That would bring up a menu that allowed me to choose which one of the two methods I would like to install by. And so that's basically how I did it.
Do you prefer, like, if you were going to install Linux on a computer, would you prefer to use UEFI or just regular BIOS?
I don't really care.
I personally say I've tried both. I've found that with legacy support is the term you're looking for, which is
Correct,
the basic
yeah.
BIOS. That when you use, a lot of people think you have to do it for Linux. You don't. All you have to do is you have to turn secure boot off, which you can re-enable it after it's installed. But I don't usually see any value in doing that.
Yeah.
Nowadays, Linux comes with a boot /EFI/boot folder, and inside there's what's called a shim x86 file, and that's the actual shims that will allow it to boot EFI.
I personally find that UEFI has been faster to boot in my testing. Like, I've tested both. UEFI boots a lot faster than just legacy support does.
Some HP laptops are pure hell to get them to boot the way you want to on without the EFI, and still with the EFI, it's cumbersome.
This is actually on an HP laptop that I did this, and I didn't have any issues. It's on EFI, and it's running Fedora, and I've had no issues.
Did it come with Windows 8?
It came with Windows 10.
It came with Windows 10. The ones that came with Windows 8 I find give the most problems.
There actually is another one. I put Zorin OS on. It was my dad's old computer. It came with Windows 8. I actually put Zorin OS. I don't remember. I actually don't think this computer had a UEFI. I think it was before UEFI was a thing.
Windows 8 was always UEFI.
Maybe it was. I don't remember. But
yeah, it's the GPT partition that the computer's looking for.
Issues with installing Linux on there. This computer, though, the Lenovo computer I'm on, came with Windows 7. It does not have a UEFI. It's just completely regular.
Windows 8
BIOS.
and beyond used UEFI. Windows 7 used legacy. Of course, I'm not so sure that there's not a way to get Windows 7 to boot UEFI. I don't know.
I think there were some computers that came with UEFIs then, but it was just disabled.
Now, Windows 7 doesn't come with a GPT partition, so, there's no boot stuff to go in there.
Yeah, because I guess the GPT was...
It was a Windows 8 thing that started.
UEFI, yeah.
And not only that, they put the Windows actual key in the... And inside the machine, it's hard. It's hardware embedded. So if you want to update to 10, you don't need a key if you have a Windows 8 computer.
Right.
It'll automatically take the key out of the hardware.
And if you have a Windows 7 machine, so long as it's a valid key from the same machine, Well, really, even if it's not the same machine.
Oh, we should mention too, since we're in the middle of talking about this, that there were some secure boot keys are going to be revoked and reissued. So if you are running secure boot, look into that, and you're probably going to want to turn it off for a short period of time while those keys get reissued. It has to do with a security breach.
Yeah.
Does this have to do with Linux?
Yeah, Linux. So anything downstream of Debian secure boot keys are going to need to be reissued, and it's coming up soon. I can't exactly remember exactly when that is. Maybe one of you guys knows.
I don't
Yeah.
specifically set secure boot keys, although it's something that I want to start doing because it does provide a little more security.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't really have a problem with without using secure boot. I typically disable it, but and I don't really see a use for it.
When
Yeah.
you're doing work for clients, you want to do everything you can to make it secure.
Yeah.
That'll help prevent. What it'll do, it helps prevent infections from
Rootkits.
advanced persistent infections like rootkits and ransomware and what have you from changing from writing to the disk, the SSD or the hard disk on boot. It prevents a lot of persistent infections.
Yeah.
It's a huge step forward in technology, really, for booting drives.
So we burned our last 15 minutes there on Linux stuff, which is even better than what I had thinking about. But we're going to go ahead and wrap this part up here for now.
Also, Quint, it's more capable. UEFI also boots faster and more security, and it's definitely superior. So yeah, go ahead.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this part. So we will catch you guys tomorrow for the weekly news roundup. And I promise, no election talk in the weekly news roundup. I'm sick of it. I'm sure you guys are too. Unless there's something hilariously comical, I'll throw it in the silly veil. But no, I'm going to avoid most of that. So anyway, guys, we will catch you guys at the next one. You guys have a final word or not? Just like keep it like a couple final words.
One of the great things about Linux nowadays is that the installer is awesome. I mean, it blows the Windows installers away. You can install most Linux distros in 15 minutes or less.
Yep, absolutely.
And you have more granular customization and installers. You can find me on YatesNet on Twitter, Yates Networks on YouTube and Library. I also have a personal channel, America's Finest, where I upload covers of songs. I am working on getting more content uploaded on that channel. And I also have a video I'm finishing on the main channel, Yates Networks, which is my work channel. Again, America's Finest is the personal covers where I sing songs. Okay.
And that's on YouTube?
Yes. America's Finest is on YouTube and on Library soon. If it's not on Library yet, I think I've created the channel, but I've got to get channel art for both.
Excellent. All right. Sounds good. Quint, final words?
I really just say that I think everyone's here has had a different Linux experience, and I'm sure your Linux experience will probably be different from ours. And that's really just the great thing about Linux is that it can accommodate so many different use cases and things.
Yep. CJ missing
it's everywhere. He's Linux is everywhere.
Say hi, CJ?
Literally.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Come on.
It's in your home. It's in your hand. It's out in the field on a farmer's ranch. It's everywhere.
He's been sleeping on the floor.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it's running the farm tractors that all the farmers are complaining about.
It's got
It probably. I'm sure, like all the car infotainment systems. I think I read this somewhere. Most of them, I think, except the Fords. I think the Fords use some embedded version of Windows because they all say powered by Microsoft. But I know, like the ones in GM cars are Linux powered.
Woohoo! Go GM. All right. Well, we will catch you guys next time tomorrow, 9:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the weekly news roundup. And today on my Christian channel here at 9 Eastern Time, which is 1 hour from now, we will be going into the second chapter of the book of Hebrews. So I'll go ahead and post that if you guys are interested in that. You can go ahead and check out that video at 9 o'clock on my other channel. We will catch you guys later.